Steve Harvey, the king of comedy, the face of Family Feud, and the man who made millions laugh across the world. But behind the flawless suits and roaring applause hides a story the world rarely saw. Poverty, humiliation, broken families, and scars that never healed. This is not just the journey of a celebrity. This is the story of a man who rose from the backseat of a broken car to the heights of global fame, while carrying tragedies that were beyond heartbreaking. Childhood scars and early humiliation. Steve Harvey was not born into comfort, but into struggle. On January 17, 1957, in the small coal town of Welch, West Virginia, he entered a world where poverty was not a condition. It was a constant shadow. His father, Jesse Harvey, worked as a coal miner, lungs scarred by endless shifts underground. His mother, Eloise Vera, stretched every penny as a teacher, trying to feed 5 children on wages that barely lasted a week. When the family later moved to Cleveland, Ohio, settling on East 112th Street, life hardly improved. The neighborhood was tough, opportunities scarce, and every dream felt like it suffocated under the weight of survival. Decades later, that same cracked and broken street would be renamed Steve Harvey Way. But back then, it was simply the road a poor boy with holes in his shoes walked every day. Poverty was merciless. Food was thin, and clothes were patched until they crumbled, and winters were so bitter that no blanket could keep out the cold. But hunger and frost were only part of his burden. The other part was his voice. Steve stuttered. Every word was a battlefield, each sentence a minefield of broken syllables. In classrooms, his stammer drew laughter. Children mocked him, teachers shook their heads in frustration. And layered over his poverty and speech struggles was the color of his skin. In the 1960s Midwest, a poor black boy with a stutter was not expected to dream of success. He was expected to survive, and nothing more. But Steve's dream was bigger than survival. One afternoon in elementary school, his teacher asked the children to write down what they wanted to be when they grew up. Some scribbled doctor. Others wrote policeman or nurse. Steve, with shaky handwriting and oversized dreams, wrote, "I want to be on television." The room froze. Then came the laughter, sharp, mocking, cruel. The teacher ripped the paper in half, smirked, and told him it was impossible. A poor, stuttering black boy from Cleveland on TV? She even called his parents, scolding them for letting their son dream too big. Steve never forgot the sound of that paper tearing. He said later, "I still hear it." That rip cut deeper than any word could his mother's eyes showed quiet shame, but his father refused to let the moment kill his son's dream. Jesse Harvey looked into Steve's eyes and said firmly, "Write it down again. Put it on your wall. Read it every morning and every night. Make it your promise." Those words became Steve's lifeline. From that day forward, he repeated his dream like a prayer. Every morning, every night, even as classmates mocked him, he clung to that fragile vow, "I will be on TV." Years later, when that impossible dream became reality, Steve never forgot the wound or the lesson. Every Christmas, he sent that same teacher a brand new television with a note attached. "From the student you said would never make it." It was his way of turning humiliation into victory, of reminding the world that the boy mocked for stuttering would one day speak into every living room in America. Odd jobs, struggles, and homelessness. After graduating from Glenville High School in 1974, Steve Harvey stepped into adulthood with the same fragile vow burning in his heart. "I will be on TV." But life was not interested in honoring his promise just yet. Instead, it dragged him through years of endless jobs that barely kept food on the table. He carried mail under freezing skies until his fingers went numb. He scrubbed carpets until his knuckles bled. He sold insurance door to door, often met with slammed doors and cold rejection. He worked as a mechanic, turned wrenches until his body ached, and even climbed into boxing rings to take punches just to earn a paycheck. Every shift ended the same way, His wallet nearly empty, his spirit even emptier. The dream that once shimmered on a piece of paper felt like a fading lantern, flickering in a tunnel of endless night. Then came one night in 1985 that changed everything. In a small, smoky Cleveland club, a friend dared Steve to step up at an open mic event. He had nothing to lose. His heart pounded as he stumbled through the first joke, then another, and then it happened. Laughter. Real laughter. The crowd cracked open, and for the first time, Steve felt free. When the host handed him $50 for the performance, Steve walked out into the cold night with tears streaming down his face, clutching that crumpled bill like treasure. He whispered through sobs, "I was born tonight." The very next morning, he quit his job. For the first time, he knew who he was meant to be, but destiny rarely offers a straight path. After that breakthrough, Steve spent the next 3 years not in apartments or hotels, but in the backseat of a broken 1976 Ford. That car became his home. The backseat was his bed. A cooler in the trunk was his refrigerator. Gas station sinks and public pool showers were his bathrooms. Nights were merciless. Hunger gnawed at his stomach until sleep became the only escape. Cheap sandwiches stretched for days, sometimes replaced with nothing at all. He sat in the driver's seat watching streetlights flicker on strangers' faces, terrified that someone might see through the glass and discover his secret life. It was depressing, he later admitted. You can do it for a week, but 3 years. Yet, even in those darkest nights, he clung to his father's words. Read it again. Make it your promise. He murmured that dream morning and night inside the silence of that car, reciting it like scripture. At his lowest point, he nearly surrendered. One night, ready to call his father and admit defeat, he pressed play on his answering machine first. 2 messages blinked. The first was from a club in Jacksonville offering $150. The second was for another gig the very next night. Another $150. Together, it was $300, just enough to buy a cheap flight to New York. And in New York, the producers of Showtime at the Apollo were waiting. Had he missed those calls? Had he given up just a moment earlier? The story of Steve Harvey might have ended in silence. But survival often arrives through unexpected angels. A kind couple, Rich and Becky Liss, saw his determination and gave him a carpet-cleaning contract and a line of credit so he could keep traveling. Years later, Steve would break down on national television, calling them live to say thank you, promising to repay their kindness for the rest of his life. Those years of hunger, ridicule, and nights spent in the back seat of a car did not crush him. They carved him. They shaped him into a man ready to rise. The boy once mocked for stuttering now stood on the edge of destiny, scarred but unbreakable. Rise of a comedy star. By 1990, Steve Harvey's persistence finally began to pay off. The boy who once stuttered in a Cleveland classroom now stood on the stage at the Johnny Walker National Comedy Search. His name was called as a finalist, and the same voice that had once been mocked now poured out sharp, confident jokes that sliced through doubt and erupted into thunderous applause. That night was not just a contest, it was proof. Proof that the dream ripped apart by a teacher years ago was no longer just a fragile wish, it was becoming reality. Soon after, Steve stepped onto one of the most legendary stages in comedy, Showtime at the Apollo. Behind those curtains, he was not just a comedian, he was a survivor of hunger, humiliation, and nights spent curled in the backseat of a Ford. When the lights hit and the laughter rolled, every cheer felt like redemption. Harlem lights replaced gas station lamps. The roar of the Apollo audience drowned out the silence of his loneliest nights. But this rise came at a heavy price. For 7 years, Steve carried the Apollo on his shoulders, transforming the stage into his battlefield. Comedy became more than jokes, it became survival. Each laugh was armor against shame, each standing ovation a shield against poverty. But behind the glamour, his body was breaking. He endured 18-hour days, writing jokes until dawn, hosting shows, traveling on sleepless flights. His voice frayed, his back ached, and his mind teetered on the edge of collapse. He later admitted, "The laugh you hear is the wound I turned inside out." Yet he kept going, and the world began to notice. In 1994, Steve starred in Me and the Boys. 2 years later came The Steve Harvey Show, a sitcom that became a cultural landmark, running until 2002. For millions, Harvey was no longer just a comedian. He was living proof that laughter could rise from the ashes of despair. Then came the tour that crowned him. From 1997 to 2000, Steve joined Cedric the Entertainer, D.L. Hewley, and Bernie Mac for the Kings of Comedy Tour. Night after night, arenas shook with roaring crowds. When Spike Lee captured it all in the original Kings of Comedy 2000, Steve Harvey's name was etched forever in the soul of American culture. The man who had once slept in a car now stood in front of stadiums chanting his name. The sound was almost unbearable in its beauty. For someone who once feared the world would forget he even existed, the reality was overwhelming. But even then, behind the pride, his body whispered warnings: exhaustion, stress, the quiet toll of carrying a crown too heavy for too long. Each cheer reminded him of the nights he went hungry. Each spotlight reminded him of the darkness he came from. And sometimes, he admitted softly, each success also reminded him of everything he had missed while chasing it. The legend was being born. But in the shadows, his personal life was beginning to crack. Family breakdowns and painful marriages. While Steve Harvey's career was climbing toward the heights he had once only whispered about, his personal life was beginning to collapse under the weight of his ambition. Fame was pouring into his life, but so too were sacrifices. And the first cost he ever paid was his family. Back in 1981, long before his breakthrough, Steve had married Marcia, the quiet, steady woman who believed in him, when he was just a struggling young man with a fragile dream and empty pockets. Together they built a family, raising 3 children, twin daughters, Brandy and Carly, and a son, Broderick Jr. For a time, their home carried the sound of children's laughter, a sweetness unmatched by any stage applause. But behind the walls of their house was a very different story. The cupboards were often bare, the bills stacked higher than the furniture, and the reality of poverty grew heavier as Steve chased comedy gigs across small towns that rarely paid enough to cover the rent. Nights under stage lights meant mornings missed at home. The dream that was supposed to lift them began to pull him away from them. Steve would later confess with a voice heavy with regret, "I lost my family chasing the dream." The marriage unraveled, not because love was absent, but because distance and struggle had hollowed it out. Marcia was left to shoulder motherhood nearly alone, raising 3 children while Steve tried to prove to the world that his dream was worth something. By the time the divorce was finalized in 1994, Harvey was emotionally drained and financially stripped. He was a man who could make strangers roar with laughter, but could not stop the quiet tears in his own house. The wound of losing his first family never truly healed. For his children, the cost was years without a father's presence. For Steve, it was the guilt of knowing that his pursuit of success had come at the deepest personal price. 2 years later, in 1996, Harvey thought he had found a second chance. He married Mary Shackelford, a woman who seemed to offer warmth and stability in the whirlwind of fame. Their union felt like a healing balm on old wounds, and in 1997, the birth of their son, Wynton, seemed to seal the promise of redemption. For a while, their home echoed with joy. Steve adored Wynton, later calling him "my compass," the reason I kept standing. Photos from those years showed a man smiling on living room carpets, his baby crawling across his chest, his wife close by. For a man who had once lived in a car, this felt like proof that life had finally balanced the scales. But storms have a way of returning. As Harvey's career accelerated with sitcom tapings, the Apollo stage, and the Kings of Comedy Tour, his marriage began to buckle under the same weight that had crushed the first one: absence. Nights on the road turned into weeks, weeks into months. Mary longed for stability, for a husband who was home at dinner, not on a stage. Steve, haunted by the terror of poverty, was consumed by survival and success. Arguments replaced quiet dinners. Silence stretched between them like a gulf. By 2005, after nearly a decade together, the collapse was unavoidable. But this time, the heartbreak was not private. It unfolded under the blinding glare of cameras. Mary went public with accusations that slashed at Harvey's reputation, painting him as unworthy of the image he had fought to build. Courts would later dismiss many of her claims, but the verdict of public opinion was merciless. Tabloids devoured the scandal, turning Steve into a headline not for comedy but for controversy. Harvey admitted later that this divorce left the heaviest scars on my spirit and on my image. He once feared invisibility. Now he was overexposed, judged, dissected, condemned for mistakes both real and imagined. The deepest wound, though, was not the headlines. It was the fracture at home. Winton was only 8 years old when his parents' marriage collapsed into bitterness. After the divorce, the boy lived with his mother, leaving Steve with only fragments of time. Holidays here, weekends there. "I could survive the tabloids," Harvey confessed, "but seeing that pain in my boy's eyes, that broke me." Alone in hotel rooms, adored by millions but powerless to shield his son, Steve felt stripped bare once again. Years later, when Winton chose to live with him as a teenager, Harvey called it a second chance from God, a miracle he did not deserve, but one he clung to with gratitude. Looking back, Harvey did not call these years just a divorce. He called them a crucible, a furnace of public shame and private agony. The man who had risen from homelessness to household fame now felt as though everything was being taken from him once again, not in poverty, but in dignity, peace, and the comfort of family. Still, he endured, scarred, weary, humbled, but still standing. Financial collapse and IRS nightmare. By the mid-2000s, Steve Harvey was a household name. His face was on television, his voice filled radio airwaves, and his presence on stage drew roaring crowds. From the outside, it looked like he had conquered every obstacle. But behind the polished image was a storm so fierce it nearly destroyed him. In 2005, reeling from the collapse of his second marriage, Steve walked into a bank, inserted his card, and stared at the screen. The number glowed back at him like a cruel joke: $1,700. That was all he had. For a man whose name filled arenas, that figure cut deeper than poverty ever had. But humiliation was only the beginning. Soon came the discovery that would drag him to the edge of ruin. For 7 years, due to a disastrous accounting failure, his taxes had gone unfiled. Principal, interest, penalties, layer upon layer. The debt swelled into millions, a mountain so high it threatened to crush him. Steve later admitted that the fear was unbearable. He had once feared hunger. Now he feared something worse: prison, disgrace, and the erasure of everything he had built. At night, lying alone in hotel rooms, he stared at ceilings haunted by two thoughts. What if I lose everything? What if my children see me fall? But in the face of ruin, Steve did what survivors do. He fought. He built a schedule as relentless as hunger itself. Long before sunrise, while the city still slept, he was in a studio, his voice carrying across the nation on a morning radio show. That microphone became his lifeline, the one battlefield where he still felt powerful, even as debt loomed over him like a shadow. Every joke I told in those days, he confessed, was paid for in fear. Fear became fuel. Discipline became armor. Every dollar was treated like a soldier. Every gig was a battle against despair. Days blurred into nights. Radio in the morning, meetings by day, stages by night. No pauses, no luxuries. He stacked opportunities on top of exhaustion, refusing to let the avalanche of debt bury him alive. Out of this grind came his books. In 2009, Act Like a Lady, Think Like a Man, turned his scars into wisdom, selling millions and later becoming a hit film. In 2010, he wrote Straight Talk, No Chaser. Each page was more than advice, it was survival. Each sale was another brick holding creditors at bay. Then came the turning point of destiny. In 2010, Steve took the stage as the host of Family Feud. Within 3 years, ratings exploded to historic highs. What began as just another gig became his resurrection. The man who once slept in a Ford now appeared in America's living rooms every night. Not as a victim of debt, but as the face of laughter itself. Still, the climb was brutal. Harvey admitted that for years, every paycheck went straight to the IRS. Standing ovations on television were followed by nights of calculators, fear, and prayers that the shadow of debt would not erase him completely. "I thought I was finished," he said, "but God wasn't done with me." Dollar by dollar, gig by gig, prayer by prayer. He clawed his way out. The whispers of humiliation, "You're finished, you're done," were drowned out by proof that resilience could turn disgrace into testimony. By the late 2000s, Harvey had rebuilt not just his fortune, but his dignity, his discipline, and his faith. That chapter of $1,700 and 7 years of taxes was never just about numbers. It was about shame, survival, and the terror of failing his children. But it was also about what comes next. On his knees, he prayed. From his knees, he fought. And when he rose, he carried scars that spoke louder than any punchline. Scars that proved faith and discipline can turn the weight of ruin into the very foundation of redemption. Redemption through Marjorie and blended family. After years of chaos, heartbreak, and near financial ruin, Steve Harvey's life felt like a battlefield of scars. 2 broken marriages. Children who had grown up watching their father disappear into the grind. A bank account that once mocked him with only $1,700. Nights when the fear of prison and disgrace hung heavier than any stage light. He had survived, but survival is not the same as living. And then came Marjorie Bridges. Their story felt like something written by fate itself. Years earlier in Memphis, long before his empire was built, Steve spotted her in the audience during a comedy show. In front of strangers, he paused, pointed to her, and said, "I don't know who you are, but I'm going to marry you one day." Life pulled them apart then, but destiny has patience. In 2005, bruised by scandal and nearly broken in spirit, Steve crossed paths with Marjorie again. This time, the timing was right. 2 years later, at the age of 50, scarred but still standing, Steve kept his word. He married her. From the start, she was not just his wife, she was his healing. Where fame had made him frantic, she brought calm. Where pain had left him fractured, she made him whole. She reminded him to sleep when he would have worked himself to exhaustion, urged him to eat when his body bore the strain of endless shows, and prayed over him when his doubts threatened to crush him. Steve himself admitted, 85% of everything I have came after I married her. And he was not talking about money, he was talking about peace. Together, they built a blended family of 7 children, Steve's 4 and Marjorie's 3, plus the youngest, Winton. At first, there was distance. Stepchildren carry hesitation, questions, sometimes resentment. But Steve refused to let the word step define them. He gave her children his last name. He showed up with consistency. Car rides to school, quiet talks before bed, dinners where he listened more than he spoke. Over time, trust replaced hesitation, and love replaced distance. The world saw the depth of that bond in 2015 during a televised tribute. Jason, Marjorie's son, turned to Steve and said, "You gave me your last name. There's no one better than you, Dad." The audience fell silent. Cameras caught Harvey's face crumple as he broke down in tears. Not as a comedian, not as a celebrity, but as a man finally forgiven by life. For someone who had once confessed, "I lost my first family chasing the dream," that moment was more than affection. It was grace. It was redemption. With Marjorie, Harvey discovered something he had never truly known: belonging. Evenings around the dinner table filled with laughter, birthdays with every child together, vacations where he was not Steve Harvey the star, but simply Dad. She gave him what fame, money, and applause never could: a home. a sense of peace that no crown or empire could ever replace. And for Steve Harvey, this was the chapter that mattered most. Not the stages, not the shows, not the mansions. This was the chapter where shame became grace, where scars became strength, where a man who had nearly lost everything finally discovered the quiet, ordinary miracle of having it all. Empire, style, and legacy. With Marjorie by his side and a healed family behind him, Steve Harvey stepped into the most powerful phase of his life. No longer just a comedian or television host, he became the architect of a global empire, one that stretched across continents, industries, and generations. Since 2010, Harvey has been the face of Family Feud. Under his hosting, ratings skyrocketed, making it one of the most watched game shows in America. Soon, its success spread far beyond the United States. Through his company, Steve Harvey Global, he helped license Family Feud to countries like South Africa and Ghana, even preparing to host a Botswana version himself. For a man once mocked for dreaming too big, standing at the center of an international stage was more than success. It was vindication. But his influence was not confined to television. His syndicated Steve Harvey morning show reached millions every single day, becoming a daily ritual for households and commuters alike. His best-selling books turned into survival maps for people struggling with relationships, careers, and self-belief. His voice had transformed from a stutter that once invited ridicule to a guiding presence millions leaned on for wisdom. And then came his ventures outside entertainment. Harvey co-founded Level and Levate USC, supplement brands promoting health and wellness, reflecting his own transformation into a man obsessed with discipline, longevity, and vitality. For Steve, these were not just businesses, they were legacies, designed to outlast the fleeting lights of television. His empire grew into television, radio, publishing, production, fashion, and health. He often told others, "Never depend on one stream when you can create many." It was not fear that drove him anymore. It was foresight. The wisdom of a man who had once been stripped down to $1,700 and never wanted to taste that vulnerability again. His outward lifestyle became a symbol of reinvention. In 2020, Harvey secured one of Atlanta's crown jewels, a 17-acre estate once owned by Tyler Perry. At nearly 35,000 square feet, the property was valued at $15 million, with a gym, spa, infinity pool, home theater, and even a hidden ballroom. To outsiders, it was extravagance. To Steve, it was permanence, a fortress after decades of instability. His garage told another story. Vintage Cadillacs, Rolls-Royce Phantoms, Bentleys, not just cars, but milestones. His wardrobe, too, became legendary. With stylist Ellie Caramo guiding him, Harvey turned into a fashion icon at nearly 70. Bold monochrome suits, sharp lines, and fearless colors regularly went viral, proving that style has no age limit. Every detail spoke of confidence. A man once defined by scarcity now lived defined by abundance, not just of wealth, but of vision. And yet, even as the empire gleamed, shadows lingered. Behind the immaculate suits and lavish mansions lay a man still haunted by his past. He spoke openly about high blood pressure, sleep apnea, and autoimmune symptoms that reminded him of his mortality. He shed 30 pounds, committed to brutal workouts, and built a strict daily regimen because, as he said, "Health is my covenant with my family and my audience." But deeper than illness was another ghost, the memory of poverty. Even surrounded by acres of land and wealth, Harvey admitted, "I still think about $1,700. That number was no longer about money. It was about fear, humility, and discipline. It was the scar that ensured he never forgot where he came from and why he worked harder than men half his age. The world saw the empire, but behind the empire was still a man who carried scars, not as shame, but as reminders. Scars that told him to keep moving. Scars that reminded him success without gratitude is just another kind of poverty. Today, at nearly 70, Steve Harvey stands not just as a comedian or television host, but as a symbol of what it means to rise, fall, and rise again. His journey is not the straight climb of a star, it is the resurrection of a man who refused to let scars define him. From a stuttering boy humiliated in a Cleveland classroom, to a young man sleeping for 3 years in the back seat of a broken-down car, to a father who lost families in the pursuit of his dream, to a man left with only $1,700 in mountains of IRS debt. Every chapter could have been the end of his story. Yet each time, Steve Harvey chose to keep going. He turned ridicule into resilience. He turned pain into punchlines. He turned humiliation into testimony. And perhaps the greatest transformation of all, he turned brokenness into belonging. With Marjorie and their blended family, Harvey found the redemption he once thought was impossible. For him, the true treasure is not the mansions, the cars, or the fame. It is the laughter around the dinner table, the voices of children who call him Dad, and the quiet peace of finally having a home. Steve Harvey himself has said it best. Applause fades. Trophies gather dust. But family, discipline, and gratitude, these are the legacies that endure. His life is proof that resilience can outlast ridicule, that faith can carry a man through fire, and that love, even when it arrives late, can heal the deepest scars. And now, let me turn to you. Have you ever had a moment in your life when you felt reborn? When grace, or love, or second chance lifted you out of the darkest chapter? If Steve Harvey's story touched you, share your reflection below, because your words might be the reminder someone else needs that healing is possible, that no scar is final, and that the story of your life is never over until you choose to write it with love.